So welcome back to Intermediate Accounting. So for this week, we will be discussing about the other long-term investments. So what are other long-term investments? So other long-term investments include investments in funds set aside for specific and long-term purpose and cash surrender value. So our specific examples are we have the sinking fund, preference share redemption fund, asset replacement fund, expansion fund, contingency fund, insurance fund, and cash surrender value. So a sinking fund is a fund set aside for the repayment of a long-term obligation. So in other words, nag-set aside ta or naghimutag pundo kay naatay bayranan in the future, which is a long-term obligation. So para dili ta magdali-dali or manginahanglan nga binulto atong bayad kung mature na ang utang, naa na tayo na tigi og save. So, ang naka-advantage if we have a sinking fund is that while we are investing funds na atay giput up nga money sa sinking fund, we can use the money to temporarily invest. Meaning, pwede natong gamiton ang kwarta para mag-invest to securities, either equity or debt, and then mutubo ang ato ang puhunan. So, at the end of the term of our long-term obligation, nakapaginansya na nato ang ato ang pundo. At the same time, we were able to pay for our obligation. So a sinking fund may be mandatory, which is it is required based on a contract for the protection of the creditors, or it would be voluntary. So depende sa management kung ganahan ba sila mag-set up or dili. Retained earnings related to this fund could also be appropriated or may not be appropriated. So when we say appropriate na siya, so atong kuhaan ng atong free nga retained earnings or katong unappropriated nga retained earnings, and we credit the retained earnings appropriated. It could also be administered by the entity or it could be administered by a trustee. So if ang entity ang nag-administer, so siya ang nag-record sa mga transactions, siya ang nag-manage sa sinking fund. If it is by a trustee, so na ay third party or na ay separate nga entity nga nag-manage sa tuang sinking fund, so ang ato lang huwaton is maghatag og report si trustee on the developments or what are the changes in the sinking fund nga balance. So that's the time nga mag-record na ta sa tuang books once we receive the report from the trustee. The sinking fund can be classified as current or non-current depending on the maturity of the obligation. So kung ang ato ang obligation nga bayaran is mo mature pa siya og 5 years, so the sinking fund is non-current kay dugay pa man mo mature ang obligation. But if next year na mo mature ang obligation, so or within 1 year, so therefore ang ato apong sinking fund would be classified as current kay within 12 months man or within 1 year naman ang maturity sa related obligation. So here are the journal entries if the sinking fund is administered by the entity. So as I have mentioned earlier, kung ang entity ang nag-administer, so siya ang mag-manage sa sinking fund, siya po mag-record na ng transactions. So first is we have the establishment of the fund. So we transfer the ordinary nga cash or ang free nga cash to the sinking fund. So you debit the sinking fund cash and you credit cash. And then once we establish the fund, we can prepare the appropriations. Again, so it's optional if you are going to appropriate or not your retained earnings. So the entry to appropriate, so debit retained earnings and credit appropriated retained earnings. Next is if you use the money from the sinking fund to invest. So samtang nagpaabot sa maturity, pwede natong gamiton ang money from the sinking fund para mutubo siya. So your investment could either be a debt security, which is a bonds, or it could be equity, which are shares. So we have Debit sinking fund, debt or equity securities, so either na siya, and your credit sinking fund cash. And then, when you receive the investment, so for example, you receive an interest, so this is in the form of interest. So, if na-interest sa investment, so na-receive na itong money, so debit, sinking fund cash, and credit, interest income. Okay? Next, what if there is an increase in the fair value of the investment? So, related siya atong atoanang na-invest. So, for example, so these are sinking fund securities. So, debit sinking fund securities, equity securities, and credit, unrealized gain, profit or loss. Next would be any adjustments to the retained earnings appropriated due to the interest income and any increase in the fair value. So just debit retained earnings and appropriated retained earnings. Next is what if there is a decrease in the fair value? So bali, appropriated retained earnings and credit retained earnings. Next, number 7. So you have sale of the securities. So when we sell the securities, of course, we receive money. So sinking fund cash and credit the sinking fund securities. Again, this is either debt Banicia or this is equity. And remember, it's either there's a gain or a loss. So if there is a gain, so that is credit. Kung loss pa na siya, so debit the loss. So loss on sale. Then, of course, you have to appropriate for the gain. So, you have appropriated retained earnings, then retained earnings. And once na mag-mature na ang ato ang obligation, so we need to pay for the obligation. So, debit the bonds payable, you debit the interest, ang nag-accrue, and credit sinking fund cash. So, the money nga na-accumulate nato sa sinking fund, mao yatong ipambayad sa utang. And lastly, we need to revert back, iuli nato ang sinking fund nga money back to the general fund. So, to return, so you simply debit cash and you credit sinking fund cash, and you reverse the remaining amount of sinking fund, you debit appropriated retained earnings, and you credit retained earnings. What if the sinking fund is managed by a trustee? So, the entries would be, so you debit sinking fund trustee and you credit cash. And then once you get the report or the statement of fund balance from the trustee, so you debit sinking fund trustee and any investment income, so you credit the investment income. Once you pay for the obligation, so simply debit bonds payable, interest expense, and credit sinking fund trustee. So the sinking fund trustee represents the money that you have in the sinking fund. And why is this interest expense, ma'am? Because naturally, ang atoan namang ma-receive ani nga or ang atong ma-record na ani kay kato namang yung interest expense. So once we pay for that, og na-incur na po nato siya within the same year, so ang i-debit nato interest expense. Pero kung previously nag-record tag interest uh, expense, nag-credit tag interest payable, so ang atong i-debit diri kay interest payable. So either interest expense or interest payable, so depende kung unsa na ang ato ang na-recognize. Then remittance of the remaining cash of the sinking fund from the trustees, so pag uli na ni trustee ang atong money, so i-debit nato ang cash and i-credit nato ang sinking fund trustee nga account. So meaning wala na money kung na-remit na tanan nga balance. Wala na money sa ato ang sinking fund. It becomes an ordinary cash. So, the next question here is, pila may dapat na akong i-contribute kung na ako'y target nga bayro nun in the future? So, for example, ang atong bonds payable kay 5 million in 5 years. So, natay duha ka question na niya. What if mag-put up lang ko og kas karon nya gusto ganahan ko nga mo accumulate na siya mo tubo na siya within 5 years, and then I will be able to pay the 5 million nga obligation, or pwede sad nga I have annual contribution or I have semi-annual contribution to the fund to accumulate 5 million. So, pwede na siya nga one-time payment, nya mahimo na siyang 5 million after 5 years. Or pwede sad nga natay regular contribution, so silbing itingi-tingi nato. So, pwede na siya. So, ang atong gamiton ani is the future value nga formula. So future value meaning you have already your target amount in the future, which is the value of the liability we want to extinguish. So for example, katong 5 million. So ang pangitaon nato ani kung pila man ato ang cash flow. So unsa man ang cash flow, kana ang ato ang contribution to the fund. So kani ang ato ang pangitaon. Kaning future value factor is ma-solve man ni siya or mapangita man ni siya sa ato ang factor nga table. So again, what we're looking for is the cash flow or the contribution to the fund. So it depends kung unsa man ang ato ang contribution, is it one time or regular. So this is the general formula. So the contribution to the fund is equivalent to the future value divided by the future value factor. Actually, this is derived from this original lang formula. So you have here what factor to use. So if it is one-time payment, ang factor nato is future value of 1. But if this is a regular uniform payments, so na ay pirmi nga bayaran, pwede nga annually ba na siya, semi-annually, monthly, basta ka uniform payments, ang gamiton kay future value of ordinary annuity of 1. Okay? Naputay variation, what if ang imuhang payment kay at the start of the period. For example, at the start of every month, at the start of every year, at the start of every semi-annual. So, ang gamito na po nato ana is ang annuity due. Okay? So, kaning ordinary annuity is after the end of the period or end of the payment terms. For example, at the end of the month, after 1 year, after one semi-annual, mo ng ordinary annuity. Pero pag at the start of the payment, like start of the year, start of the semi-annual, start of the month, then we're going to use the annuity due. Then we have another type of fund. We have the preference share redemption fund. So mamundo ta og kwarta para mag-redeem og preference shares. So paliton balik. Paliton balik nga naman because there's a mandatory redemption. Meaning naanay agreement or nanagyo na siya corresponding obligation to redeem or paliton balik. So the treatment for the preference share redemption fund is the same with the sinking fund, and appropriation of retained earnings is generally required if that is a preference share redemption fund. Then we have also the asset replacement and the expansion. So may kalahian sa replacement o expansion. So replacement, pulihan. Ang expansion, dugangan. Okay? So replace, for example, ang imuhang door nga glass kay nabuak, so pulihan po nimo og glass nga door, same ra gihapon, so that's replacement. In accounting naa ra batay term nga replacement og improvement. So, pag moingon tag replacement, that's same quality. Okay? So, usually, kung natin existing, pulihan siya niya. Naputay term nga improvement, that is with superior quality. Okay? But anyway, so this is a replacement. So, basta kay pulihan. So, ngano man nga magpundo ta, kay naatay pulihan, natay ilisan. Okay? And similar accounting for sinking fund and expansion is naatay expansion. So, nag-add ba kag another wing sa imong building, nag-add ba kag another branch, nag-expand ba kasi imong restaurant. So, that's an expansion. So, you need money for that expansion. So, mag-put up ka og fund. And again, this is same accounting for the accounting for sinking fund. We also have the contingency fund and the insurance fund. So contingency is for any possible losses. You prepare for any possible losses like there are lawsuits, there are guarantees, or tax assessments. So sa mga pagpangandam ni siya, pagpangandam in case na atay mga events or na mga transactions nga mag-need og money pero dili lang siya kay igura ka nag pundo for savings pero na nakay preparahan in kaso nga makabayad ta. Then insurance, so when the company will not avail of a services of an insurance company, wala sila nag bayad og premiums. For example, sa ano ba kintahay, Sun Life, wala sila nagpalit ano, wala sila nagpalit og insurance sa Manulife nga sila rin na mundo, so sila rin nag-set up og fund, so na sila own insurance fund. So there, this can be established even there are no possible obligations. So nag-set up na sila. So again, for both contingency and sinking fund, same accounting for sinking fund. Then we have the cash surrender value. So the cash surrender value accumulates when premiums and interest paid on a whole life insurance exceed the cost of insurance. So this cash surrender value is related to an insurance. Remember, this is relating to a life insurance. Another definition of a cash surrender value, it is the amount of cash to be received from an insurance company in case the life insurance is canceled before the insured key employee dies. So mani siya ang money nga pwede nimong ma-retrieve or madawat sa insurance in case ma-cancela ang insurance. So represents the amount that can be borrowed also from the insurance company, and the amount can be used as collateral. So the cash surrender value accumulates only on whole life insurance and not on a term life or a non-life insurance. When we say as whole life, that's a type of an insurance policy that remains in force for the insured's whole life and requires premiums to be paid every year into the policy. So, dati buo kinabuhi sa gi-insure. Pag term life lang siya, so meaning there's only a specific period of time. There are fixed rate payments or there's a limited period of time. Like for example, igura ka magbutang for 10 years or 5 years ra. So, na siya term. So, naara siya specific nga period. Pag whole life, so meaning tibuok kinabuhi. So for the cash surrender value that we're going to discuss in this chapter, this would relate to the cash surrender value that is attached to a life insurance wherein the beneficiary is the entity. So for example, gi-insure nila ilahang president sa kumpanya. Kung in kaso mamatay ang president, ang makadawat sa proceeds sa insurance dili ang president or yung family but ang company. Okay? So, mo ni siya pasabot nga ang entity ang beneficiary. So, again, kung ang entity ang beneficiary, gi-insure niya ang life sa iyang employer, sa iya habang boss o sa iya habang president, pero in kaso mamatay ang gi-insured, ang makadawat sa proceeds sa insurance, dili tong namatyan but ang kumpanya. Okay? So, mao ni siyang ato ang i-discuss ani nga chapter. The beneficiary here is the entity. So, how do we record the cash surrender value? So, on initial recognition, the cash surrender value is allocated over the holding period, usually 3 years. So, the amount is allocated to the current year is recognized as a deduction from the insurance expense. That's why we credit here the insurance expense. And the cash surrender value would be debited. This is classified as a non-current investment. So, the current portion, mao ni siya ang insurance expense. And katong para sa remaining nga period, mao na siya naa sa retained earnings. Then for the subsequent periods, so any increase in the cash surrender value will be treated as a deduction from the insurance expense. So kung musa ka ang value sa cash surrender value, ma-debit ang cash surrender value and ma-credit ang insurance expense. Any cash dividends received from the insurance are not recognized as an income but a deduction from the insurance expense. So just debit cash and credit insurance expense. Upon settlement, meaning namatay itong gi-insured, so unsa man nato pag record. So when the insured key employee dies during the year, the increase in cash surrender value would be updated. So, kinahanglan natong i-adjust up to the date of death. So, for example, 3 months after the start of the year, namatay ang gi-insured nga employee. So, we need to determine how much is the required adjustment sa cash surrender value kutob sa 3 months, kutob sa pagkamatay atong employee. So the difference between the insurance proceeds received or receivable and the sum of the cash surrender value and the unexpired portion of the prepaid insurance is recognized as a gain on the life insurance. So pag madawat na nato ang proceeds sa life insurance, so mag-debit og cash. And i-close nato tong updated na nga cash surrender value. And then, i-credit nimo ang insurance expense or prepaid insurance. Depende kung unsa man tong na-record na nimo at during the time na nagbayad ta sa premiums or regular nga premiums. And then, you credit the balance gain on settlement kung credit nga side. Pero kung ang balancing figure nato nasa debit, of course, that's a loss on settlement. Okay? So for the problem solving, so you try to answer the problems in your book and we will discuss the answers during our virtual class. If you like this video, please don't forget to click subscribe and hit the notification bell to be updated with the latest video lessons. Thank you for watching.